What's up, hobby friends, and welcome to this recap video on my experience with the Path of the Worthy contest, my journey leading up to Adepticon 2023, and then talk briefly about my experience. Spoiler alert, I did clean sweep the contest, and then share a little bit about some tips and suggestions I have for those who wish to challenge me for the mantle next year. So diving right on in, I entered a piece into each of the three categories. So there was my Hulkbuster for singles. I submitted a 3 Sentinel squad to the unit entry, and then I did the Spider-Man versus Dr. Octopus for the diorama or duel category. I ended up winning gold in all three. I won the Mighty category for all three, and then the Spider-Man versus Dr. Octopus duel actually won the Worthy trophy, taking away the Odin prize. So why did I choose these three pieces? So I knew going in that I always wanted to do a duel. That was going to be my primary focus. For me, the game and the universe of Marvel Crisis Protocol has always been about stories and narratives, and I felt that the duel category was the best to showcase that. And so I always knew going in that was going to be my primary entry. I did have a couple of other ideas for both the singles and the squads. However, both due to time constraints as well as limitations based on the contest criteria, meant that I didn't really, or I wasn't able to create specific entries for those categories. So I ended up grabbing a couple of the more centerpiece models for my gaming collection, so the Hulkbuster and the Sentinels, and I just submitted those in as secondary entries. I was, as a benchmark, aiming for the gold, and then from there, placing for the Mighty and then the Worthy was entirely up to what the competition would be like in terms of the levels, the quality, the narrative, and then also judges' preference. My expectations were for sure that I was aiming for Mighty and potentially a shot at Worthy with the diorama, but I wasn't quite certain on the Hulkbuster and the Sentinels, largely because while they are very good from a technical perspective, from the way that I painted them, they, in my opinion, lack a lot of a specific narrative, largely because they weren't painted with a specific story in mind beyond what you actually see on the model in terms of the weathering and the battle damage. I do want to caveat that while the Hulkbuster and the Sentinels were just models in my own personal collection, and they were painted for the tabletop, they're gaming pieces for me. I think it's a little disingenuous for me to say that they're purely tabletop quality, because they aren't. For those of you who have followed me on social media, you'll know that I probably spent upwards of 100 hours working on the Hulkbuster, and then about 55, 60 hours for the Sentinel Prime, and then 45 to 50 hours for each of the Sentinels. So all in, you're looking at 250, 260 hours between those four models. It's quite a lot, and so I think when you look at them, don't think of them as, oh, I just grabbed tabletop pieces and threw them in there for the sake of. These are pieces that I painted to a very high quality that I use for gaming, but were painted in mind of being centerpiece models. So I think for the purpose of entering the contest, I painted them to a very technical high standard. What they are lacking is in narrative, and so I think for those pieces, I got carried on my technical proficiency, even though I think some of the other pieces entered in those categories had stronger narrative. So with those two out of the way, I just want to caveat that the journeys for those are nothing special. It was more just putting in the reps, putting in the hours, and making sure that I was taking the breaks and taking the time I needed to be consistent in every component of the model, making sure that I was being very precise with my highlights, smooth with my blends, and the journey for those four models in particular, especially with the Hulkbuster, because I've never painted a model in entirely non-metal metal, there was a lot of challenges in terms of working through the light sourcing and the reflections. And I definitely came out of those four pieces a much stronger painter and a much more confident painter when painting a piece that is that scale, that is predominantly non-metal metal. So the journey leading up to the Path of the Worthy, I didn't actually start my diorama until probably, I think, the second week of February. A combination of just commission work and other projects for Adepticon meant that I want to get those out of the way first, and then was able to focus all of February and the weeks of March leading up to Adepticon purely on my own projects. So I had originally budgeted about a week for the diorama, and it ended up taking 3, a lot longer than I expected, and that was largely due to the challenges that I encountered when I was painting the piece. The actual concept phase started way back actually in the summer of 2022 when the Path of the Worthy contest came across my radar, and was around the time that I was basically committing to going to Adepticon. I had struggled a lot with finding the pieces that I wanted to use and to paint for the diorama, and a lot of it was down to the story and the vision that I had in mind, the narrative I wanted to tell, and what pieces could potentially fit that would also be fun to paint, would showcase my technical ability, my proficiency as a painter, but at the same time also challenge me as a storyteller. I am not typically a competition painter. I've dabbled in it in the past. I think my last Golden Demon would have been 2007, 2008, right around the time that Games Workshop North America ended up closing and they stopped hosting a lot of Golden Demons, specifically in Canada. I know that they still have the occasional one, or had the occasional one in the States, but then even those went away up until Adepticon started hosting it again these past few years. So I dabbled in it when I was younger and more youthful. I did want the Slayer Sword, but ever since Golden Demon in North America went away, I effectively focused a lot on army painting and on tabletop painting and gaming. And that's sort of been where my hobby passion has been for the past decade and a half. I've only recently, in the past few years, really tried to push myself on that more display competitive level, and painting duels, dioramas, telling stories has never been my forte. I do have a background in art and illustration. I've got a Bachelor of Illustration from Sheridan College. I have a decade of experience as a game designer and an art director, but that's always been in a two-dimensional space, and it's always been from a more graphic design, communication-oriented style, and never one for a more interpretive storytelling style. So this, for me, was a pretty challenging piece, but also a really exciting piece for me to work on, because it allowed me to really push the boundaries of what my knowledge and experience was in storytelling, and to try and create a piece that encapsulated the Spider-Man narrative, because I grew up with the cartoons and the comics, as well as the narrative of the game of Marvel Crisis Protocol, trying to take those wonderful models and pieces that they've made and tell an inclusive story that doesn't require any sort of context or explaining. I settled on the Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus pieces. I was going to pull from the Rivals box, and I'd originally tried to use as many of the components of that kit as possible, including the construction rubble and debris, but it ended up not really fitting the perspective and the way that I wanted to present the story. The pieces weren't exactly fitting the visual story that I had in mind, and so I ended up having to spend a week figuring out how to build the composition and to scratch build a lot of the components for the piece. So a lot of the actual plinth itself is scratch built. So I used a roller with some milliput to do the brickwork. I used plastic hard for the piping. I reused the webbing from the Rivals kit to do the webbing on the window, as well as Spider-Man attaching to Dr. Octopus. I scratch built the DSLR camera. I did 3D print the window, largely because I wanted the Victorian crown molding on the top and bottom, and then the explosion and the models themselves were pulled from the Rivals box. I rebuilt and scratch made all of the tentacles because I wanted to elevate the height of Dr. Octopus. I really wanted to make sure that I had him and Spider-Man posed and interacting in a very specific way. And the stock tentacles were insufficient. They weren't long enough, they weren't posed properly enough. And so I made the decision to spend a lot of time reposing and positioning to make sure that the position of the two figures was perfect, or as perfect as I could get it, as a 360 piece. I made the decision early on as well to not have a backdrop. The positioning of the figures, I really wanted that top-down Dr. Octopus bearing down on Spider-Man, and then Spider-Man looking up and sort of rotating around, or the impression of the motion of him rotating around. And because of that, I wanted to have the actual plinth form the wall of the building, which meant that I couldn't mount anything as a wall to help frame the piece. So the additional challenge of coming up with the position of the figures and developing the composition was making sure that it worked from a 360-degree view. The viewer would be able to actually view the piece from any angle and still get a sense of the story and the motion and the weight of the entire piece. As I was building, I did end up making a concession. The original concept had both of the hind tentacles flipped higher and around, and they would have been above. In particular, the shooting tentacle would have been shooting over Dr. Octopus's shoulder. But for structural reasons, the two tentacles attached to the plinth weren't sturdy enough. After I built those two tentacles, the entire piece was still too wobbly, and so I had to reposition that tentacle to give me a third point of contact. The laser, I think, was probably the weakest part of the piece, and the part of the piece I'm least happy with. But for the sake of structural integrity, I think it still works, and for the story and for the narrative, I still think it reinforces the motion of Dr. Octopus hurting Spider-Man with his lasers, and Spider-Man rotating and flying around, avoiding those, while also luring Dr. Octopus in for the camera, taking that photo, and then dancing around him. Yeah, and once that was built after that first week, it came down to painting. Much like with the original Dr. Octopus, there was huge challenges in painting the tentacles, just because it's very repetitive. The claws in particular, while they were easy the second time around because I knew what I was looking at, it was still a challenge because of how intricate they were, and that was further compounded by the fact that I had now elevated Dr. Octopus. The tentacles were twice the length, so they were going to take twice the time. And then because of the height of the piece and the way that it's built, I had to build everything together. I didn't really sub-assemble anything. It ended up being a lot more wobbly, and I had to break up those painting sessions even more so than even Hulkbuster or the Sentinels. And so I think the build part of the actual model took about 20-25 hours, and then the actual painting was another 120-130 hours. And I ended up breaking up those sessions over a period of 2 weeks, looking at like 5, 6, 7 hours depending on the day. Longer on weekends, shorter on weekdays, because I do work a full-time job. And just making sure that I was taking the time to break it down and paint each piece to the best of my ability. If I found that my quality was slipping, I would either pivot to something simpler or just take a break and reset and come back at a later time. For the learning, again, Hulkbuster and the Sentinels, I think for the most part that was more just developing my confidence in tackling a piece that was entirely non-metal. The Hulkbuster I painted probably, I want to say last summer. There was a bit of a window where I was working on other pieces. I painted Thanos, and then when I pivoted back to the Sentinels, I think it would have been early mid-November. They were a lot faster than the Hulkbuster because I had that experience and that confidence. I knew going in what to expect, and I was able to manage my approach for painting those. When looking at the actual diorama piece itself, I think afterwards, I still love staring at the piece. I think for me it was a brilliant piece of storytelling, and I'm really looking forward to challenging myself for the next pieces I'll be doing for Path of the Worthy. I'm not going to say that I've perfected storytelling, because it's really only one piece, and I still have a lot to learn and a lot to grow. I think the challenge for me moving forward is to not let this be a flash in the pan, and to try and really elevate the level of my next pieces. As Dallas was saying, I think I've set the bar, especially for myself, and I want to make sure that the next piece I do moves beyond even this one, and continues that idea of unique storytelling and storytelling with a non-traditional composition. And I think that segues nicely into the tips and suggestions I have for future challengers who want to vie for the title of mighty and worthy, or maybe just continue to pushing to elevate to go for those silvers and golds. There's really two components to painting something for a competition. The first is technical ability. That's your ability to put paint on a model. And then the second is your narrative or your storytelling. So when it comes to technical proficiency and technical ability, beyond making sure that your highlights are crisp and clean, your blends are smooth, and you're placing your lights and shadows correctly, I think what you want to make sure that you're doing is that if you're going to be looking at other artists for inspiration or for motivation, or perhaps you want to incorporate some of their styles, make sure that you're integrating that into your own to create your own unique style and not just trying to copy them. It would be a mistake for people to look at my pieces and think, okay, to win a gold, I have to paint it this way. To be mighty or to be worthy, I have to paint my pieces in this style with this type of highlighting and shading. I don't think that's true at all. I think as long as your paintwork is clean and crisp, the specific style doesn't really matter. And so that's my first tip or suggestion is don't copy me. When it comes to the way I paint my pieces, absolutely take inspiration. If you want to integrate the way I do certain things into your own style, by all means do that. Just don't try and emulate the way that I paint my models, because I feel like that takes away from your own voice as an artist. You want to make sure that when people see your pieces, they'll be able to say, oh, that's so-and-so's, not that looks like something someone else did. The second comes down to storytelling, and a lot of that has to do with composition and depth and perspective. There's many different ways to tell a story, and I'm by no means an expert, so I think it would be disingenuous for me to say that I know everything about storytelling. But one thing that I did see in a lot of the entries into this year's Path of the Worthy were, and I'm not going to say that they were compositional mistakes, but certainly I think there were weaknesses in a lot of the compositions that hurt the overall placing of a piece, and where I think these mistakes, if corrected, would definitely push these pieces a level higher, would definitely elevate them for no change in technical painting. The first has largely to do with your composition and your depth, and part of that is also the scale and size of your piece. So I'm going to caveat right now, while I may reference certain pieces in the contest, I'm not calling you out, I'm not calling anyone out, I'm not saying your pieces were bad, I'm simply offering feedback and critique as a generalism based on what I saw from those pieces. So the first is sizing and scale. It is possible to make a piece that is too big or too small. This will play in a composition, but you have to be careful that, and I apologize because this is going to ramble a lot because it all ties together. As an artist, what you don't show the viewer is equally as important as what you do show the viewer. And with what you show, there is both the positive space filled with all the stuff that you have, as well as all the negative space, which is stuff that you don't have. I think it's important to balance all of these versus negative and positive space, and then versus what you show versus what you don't show. The more that you show the viewer, the more context you're giving, and the less you're leaving to the imagination. So if you're planning a big piece with a lot of space, you have a lot more room to put in stuff, so you better take advantage of it. If you're not, if all it is just open ground or open rubble, why is it being included? Why is this space important to the narrative of your piece? Are you trying to give a sense of scale? Is that scale important? Are you trying to show that we're in a vast open desert and there's an isolation or a desolation of being alone? That could really work, for example, if your piece was Tony Stark, for example, at the end of, or I guess it would be halfway through Iron Man 1, where he's just escaped the Ten Rings, he's crashed his suit, and he's wandering alone in the desert. I think that would be a really wonderful piece to actually have a lot of open space where the entire thing might be this big and your figure might only be this small. The scale and vastness of the actual piece itself, that emptiness, plays into the emotional mindset that you're trying to convey, and I think that's really important. I think as a storytelling component, that's really, really important. But if your piece were, say, for example, and I know there was one where it was a dance-off between Star-Lord and Ronan, is showing all that open space important? Is there context there to tell us, or that we need to be shown what's happening, or could the pieces have been brought together and the plinth or the display base made a lot smaller? I think the story could have still been the same without having all that open space. I think you really need to think through the balance and the composition of your piece. And there's that word I keep using again, which is composition. Everything factors in. And a large part of this is also the backdrop. I saw a lot of pieces that had backdrops where I felt like, I'm not going to say it detracted from the piece, but it also struggled to enhance the piece. And one of the risks that you always run into with a backdrop is because you are showing more. You're limiting the viewer's focus to a specific window and you're closing it off, which means you're telling more of the story and leaving less to the imagination of the viewer to fill in those gaps. And so if you're doing that, you have to make sure that you are actually telling more. So when you have a backdrop, you need to make sure that you're integrating it with the actual pieces, the figures, along with any sort of mid and foreground elements. When you have a figure and just the backdrop, there is a large disconnect, which I think takes away from the story, and it limits what you're showing to the viewer, because you're telling them, I want you to view it from this piece, but you're only showing them, well, here's the environment they're in, and then here's the figure. I'm not saying that that's bad, but I think you can do a lot more with that. And then lastly, as a minor point, what's unseen is just as important, and I think being able to incorporate the viewer into your piece, into the storytelling, is really important. Having elements that extend beyond the display base or the plinth, having background or display elements that suggest a wider world, but you only suggest, and then you leave the rest up to the imagination of the viewer, helps to build a connection between the viewer and the piece, and it helps to emotionally invest them into it. The piece that Dallas made is a wonderful example of this, because he's used these comic panels as a background component to help frame the figures, but what he's also done is he's broken the figures and a lot of the elements outside of the frame. So you have Spider-Man and Dr. Octopus where their limbs, the webbing, the smoke of the engine extend beyond the frame of the background. You have that smoke twirling around the back, behind the panels, and then wrapping in front and connecting to the building, and then the building itself with the antenna tower extending beyond. I think the only change I would have made to that piece was having the actual antenna extend beyond the top of the panel as well, so it also breaks out. So yes, while you have a backdrop that does condense and force a certain perspective, the way that the figures break out still suggests that there's more beyond what he's showing you in those frames. So I think those are pretty much the general broad tips and suggestions I would give. I don't want to go in and critique each piece because I'd be here forever, but I do think that there is a lot to do with composition and narrative and storytelling that does factor into the success of a piece, and I feel that is equally as important, if not more important, and is worth a lot of consideration when it comes to working on your pieces. And if you're planning on entering into the path of the worthy in 2024, it is worth spending a lot of time on. So I hope that helps. And if you have, again, any questions or you're looking for a specific critique, drop me a comment below, or you can message me on Facebook. I'm fairly responsive. I'm always open to having a conversation and giving feedback and critique, or if you want me to give my input on your piece or your composition, for sure, connect with me, drop me a message, and I'll give you my feedback. So that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching. If you did, make sure you give it a like and subscribe for more weekly content. If you want to follow my other social media platforms, I'll have links in the video description below. And if you sign up for my Patreon, you can see how I built and painted my Path of the Worthy entries. So shameless plug there. So that's it for now. Until next time, happy hobbying.